Hello again, and a very warm welcome on behalf of UNDP to all the participants of this webinar. My name is Naja Hashimi. I'm the Electoral Policy Specialist with UNDP's Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa. I'm based in Amman, and I'll be moderator for this webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on elections. While the pandemic is a health crisis, its effects are reverberating across all aspects of our lives, including political lives. As we have come to know, the COVID-19 pandemic is having a direct impact on electoral calendars around the world, on the electoral process, and the state of democracy overall. Thus far, out of a total of 99 countries with elections scheduled in 2020, they were postponed in 56 of those countries, and in many cases without a future date set for the elections. In 23 countries, elections have already taken place since March amid the pandemic. Some of these elections were in conflict contexts like Mali and Guinea. And in 19 countries, elections are still expected to take place as scheduled. These numbers come from IDEA, from IFES, in UNDP sources, and our own election guru, Rafael Lopez Pintor. Thank you, Rafael. So the pandemic and its implications on elections are relevant to most of us around the world. To understand and respond to this impact, UNDP is organizing this series of webinars that bring together electoral authorities, election experts, and assistance providers to allow us to share ideas, lessons, and recommendations on ensuring the integrity of the electoral process, while at the same time protecting the health and safety of voters and other stakeholders. In the last 3 webinars, we learned of very different electoral experiences during the current crisis. We heard from EMBs where elections were postponed. That was the case of Tunisia and Mexico. We learned of the different measures taken for elections that were held during the pandemic. This was the case of Korea, in the United States, in Wisconsin and Washington, DC. And then we also heard from EMBs that are in the midst of election preparations and grappling with tough questions on timing and process. In these cases, we heard of Bolivia, Mexico, and Georgia. In those discussions, we covered a range of topics, including on voter participation, inclusive decision-making, special measures taken on election day to prevent the transmission of the virus, and the interaction between EMBs and health agencies. I will not summarize what we gained from those discussions. I won't be able to do it justice. But if you've missed any of them, you can watch the recordings on our YouTube channel. Today, in the 4th webinar, we would like to have a discussion on the challenges and opportunities the pandemic presents for electoral authorities in conflict settings. We know that elections play a significant role in peaceful resolution to conflict. However, we also know that elections can provide entry points for violence and conflicts, leading to instability and the derailment of ongoing peace processes. Technically sound elections are important in advancing and protecting fundamental political processes and human rights. But the true measure of a successful election is whether there is broad public confidence in the process and the outcome of the election. Achieving that confidence in an election and its outcome is a particularly challenging task for EMBs in conflict and post-conflict environments. For EMBs operating in these contexts, the COVID-19 pandemic presents additional layers of risks and complexities that we have not experienced in the past. What we do know is that one of the critical issues in post-conflict settings is around the timing and sequencing of elections. When should elections take place? Should they take place before the drafting of a constitution? Should they take place after the rules of the game have been drafted? The pandemic now presents new complexities for decisions on when and how elections should take place. The questions that it raises include: how will the decision impact existing political agreements and ongoing peace processes? Will it disproportionately affect the parties to the conflict? How will the redirecting of national and international funds to the pandemic response affect the decisions on elections? With the international community itself affected by the pandemic, are they able to effectively support and engage in the process? And since the pandemic is exacerbating existing inequalities in society, will the decision on elections disenfranchised groups already vulnerable and discriminated against? Will it further disenfranchise women who make up half, and in some cases more than half the population? In addition to these questions, and maybe even more challenging, is the process to reaching the decision on when and how to proceed with a planned election. With political distrust highest in countries experiencing or just coming out of conflict, there is the risk, whether real or perceived, that the virus could be used as a pretext to further delay planned transitions. How governments and electoral authorities approach and navigate these issues now during the pandemic will have far-reaching implications for stability and peace in the country for years to come. There are obviously no simple answers to any of these. They largely depend on the circumstances of each country case. Nevertheless, past elections held in conflict settings have important lessons that can help us prepare for and conduct elections during a global health pandemic. Many of these lessons come from the electoral experiences of Afghanistan, Mali, and Libya. This webinar is organized to allow us to hear and learn from these lessons so that we all are better equipped as practitioners and experts working in conflict environments to respond to the pandemic in a way that protects our human rights, promotes peace, while at the same time building long-term resilience. Today's high-level panel consists of electoral practitioners who have extensive experience in organizing and conducting elections in their countries, often in the midst of ongoing conflicts. We are grateful that they have agreed to come on this webinar and share with all of us their experience and expertise and help us discuss these issues today. We as UNDP hope you will find them useful. We encourage you to interact with the panel and each other via the chat box by sharing your comments, questions, and suggestions for future webinars. Let's try to make this as interactive as possible. Each panel member will have 10 minutes before we go into a 45-minute Q&A session. But feel free to write your questions throughout the session in the chat box. Again, to the people who joined, this webinar is offered in Spanish, English, and Arabic. Interpretation is available. The channels are there. If you have questions, please send it to us in the chat box. Now we will move to our panel. Thank you, panel members. You are at the forefront of these unprecedented times. Thank you for taking the time to join us today and share some thoughts on the pandemic and how it's affecting electoral processes in your countries. I would like to ask Mr. Abdullah Ahmadzai to kick us off. Mr. Ahmadzai is a highly respected election expert in Afghanistan, having worked for and conducted more than 5 elections in what we can all agree is an extremely challenging environment. He's the former CEO of the Commission in Afghanistan and currently serves as the country representative of the Asia Foundation. He remains closely engaged in national dialogue on electoral reform in his country, and he's here to share that experience with us. Thank you, Mr. Ahmadzai. Over to you.
Nadia, greetings to everyone attending the webinar today. I'm very pleased to see so many former colleagues and also new faces. It's an honor to be part of this interesting webinar that I've been following since the series began, and find it very useful as a great knowledge sharing platform in these difficult times. As Nadia also mentioned, COVID-19 has obviously created unprecedented challenges for the whole world and will likely continue to impact all aspects of our lives, some of us more than others, depending on our response capacity and resilience as a society. As we have seen in several studies by well-known international organizations, the impact of COVID-19 on conflict-affected countries is unfortunately greater and longer term compared to more stable and developed societies. Afghanistan is obviously one of the countries where COVID will continue to threaten lives, weaken the already donor-dependent economy, and increase pressure on our governance systems, elections, and the ongoing peace efforts with the armed opposition group, the Taliban. As I can see here, we have many people who are not only familiar with my country, but have also worked in Afghanistan on elections. But for those of us who may need some background about Afghanistan's elections history, I'd like to offer a short introduction before we move into discussing challenges and opportunities that COVID offers for meaningful and sustainable reforms. So after the September 11 attack and the subsequent fall of Taliban in 2001, Afghanistan enacted a constitution in 2004. This is to the question that Nadia raised on whether constitution should precede an election or the other way around. So in Afghanistan's case, we had our constitution enacted first, and then we had since then held about 7 elections. Our first election was presidential in 2004, and the most recent one was again our 4th presidential election held in September last year. Our system for presidential election is first past the post, where the whole country is a single constituency, while for legislature and local councils, we use the SNTV, single non-transferable voting system. Except for our first presidential election in 2004, nearly all succeeding elections were held during conflict and were also obviously disputed. Some more than others, obviously. These disputes were primarily driven by an electoral system where a winner takes it all in case of presidential elections, coupled with concerns over disenfranchisement, insecurity, election management issues, and lack of trust in electoral authorities. Our electoral reforms were largely driven by short-term political debates, mainly focused on immediate changes in structures of the EMBs and appointment mechanism for commissioners. What has been missing in these reforms, I believe, to date, were electoral input and a roadmap for a long-term comprehensive electoral reform agenda with a focus on election system, legislative reforms, confidence building, process improvements, and institutional capacity development with an aim for increasing transparency and election credibility. The coronavirus, despite its devastating effect on Afghanistan, is also, I believe, offering an opportunity for our institutions and political actors to change course and initiate debates on a more longer-term reform agenda, comprehensive enough to enable a more credible and sustainable electoral process. With our recent presidential elections, our concerns, the disputes between the 2 leading candidates might continue to threaten the country's future and its relative stability. While COVID was not necessarily the only enabler of a resolve to these disputes, it certainly played a role in encouraging the 2 leading candidates to put an end to their differences and finally sign a political agreement, which happened last month between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, who is now leading a national council responsible for peace negotiations with the Taliban. While the political agreement between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah calls for electoral system change, institutional reforms, and holding local council elections, it does not necessarily specify a timeline for such reforms or clarity on a process leading to its implementation. I believe going forward, electoral management bodies need to play a facilitating role in political dialogues and debates on electoral reforms, including any discussions on changes in our electoral system for a more meaningful, sustainable, and credible solution to our long-standing electoral challenges. COVID, I believe, will continue to threaten our lives in the foreseeable future before a vaccine is developed. And from what we are hearing, before the vaccine is developed and it reaches the population, it will take at least 2 years. So based on this assumption and understanding, there are several questions I believe we need to find answers to in similar platforms, just like this webinar today. So I'll start listing those questions. And Nadia, I'm always blamed for speaking very fast. And I know there is simultaneous interpretation, so please feel free to call on me if I speak too fast for interpreters to be able to fully translate. So the first question that comes to mind is how we can utilize the next 2 years, not only for technical changes in procedures, also use this time as an opportunity for more longer term and sustainable electoral reforms. Is it also time we build partners with healthcare providers as a permanent and integrated part of electoral planning exercise? How best can electoral assistance providers support EMBs and election process strengthening in conflict areas within the next 2 years? Is it time for a more comprehensive, conflict-sensitive electoral planning? While elections are often chosen as a peaceful and more credible alternative to any other process in conflict-affected countries, as Nadia also alluded to this, the risk of a flawed election triggering violence is also very high. How can this be prevented with a more thorough, reliable, and credible electoral process? When there's distrust in institutions, the core of any planning and changes in elections need to be based on addressing the trust deficit. This is the point I believe the president of INE from Mexico also mentioned in the last webinar, which I fully agree to. Also, automation of election processes is the immediate demand of stakeholders here in Afghanistan, and I'm pretty sure in similar contexts elsewhere too. This is merely because automation reduces human input in the process, which I believe again is a trust issue. How can electoral assistance providers support a process that makes the use of technology effective enough to address a specific set of problems without really causing more discontent? We have examples of countries which basically automated their electoral process without following the due course, and eventually it became more of a failure than a success. How can electoral agenda be taken forward in peace talks in case of Afghanistan with armed opposition groups? What's in it for the opposition groups and how they get threatened by elections? How do we save elections in a political negotiation with armed opposition groups? Now, while we do not have answers to all of these questions, the one silver lining here is the time and the sense of urgency coronavirus is offering to political actors, civil society, authorities, and international assistance providers to work together on a comprehensive approach to stabilization efforts, including long-term reforms in the electoral processes. While those points are more for a thorough discussion than a prescriptive set of recommendations, I do hope that we get the opportunity to further elaborate on these points and help us learn more from each other. Thank you, Nadia, and participants. I hope I did not overspend the allocated time that was given to me. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmadzai. You did stick to time. We are still good. I hope the translation is going well. We had a little bit of trouble, but I think we're back on track. Welcome to those of you who have joined. We started the webinar a few minutes back. We just finished the presentation of Mr. Ahmadzai on the experience in Afghanistan. He touched on an issue that has been going around in his country on the use of technology as a solution to the challenges they have. Of course, Afghanistan is going through, a series of conflicts, multi-leveled, multi-layered, and technology is not always a solution. But the pandemic, as Mr. Ahmad Zai pointed out, is actually an entry point for having a broader discussion on reforms. And I think that's a good way to approach how assistance providers like UNDP will be working with and are working with and other UN agencies with the electoral management bodies for longer term reform. So thank you, Mr. Ahmad Zai. I will now go to our second speaker. We're very grateful to have Mr. Amini from Mali. He's the Chief of Staff of the Ministry of Territorial Administration and Decentralization. This ministry is in charge of conducting elections in his country. They're one of the first countries to have an election during the pandemic period. And they also established a commission of sorts for communication and for dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. It would be wonderful to hear on what that commission was and what the experience is. Mr. Amini, you have 10 minutes. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. And you will be speaking in French, and we have translation to Spanish, English, and Arabic speaking participants. Thank you. Yep, you're good now. Thank you.
Oui, l'animateur a désactivé le partage de l'écran.
It seems that the animator, he deactivated the shared screen. Okay, I will just check my text. The animator deactivated the sharing of the screen, it seems.
Osama, can Mr. Amini share his screen? Have you enabled him? We have a PowerPoint slide to show you soon.
Can you share, please, the screen with Mr. Amini?
Our trusted Osama. I think it's good now. So, good evening, everybody. I am Amini Banko Brida, and I am the Chief of Cabinet of the Ministry, Territorial Ministry and Decentralization. And I am in charge of organizing elections in Mali. Mali is a country in West Africa. And in West Africa, we share borders with Algeria, with Nigeria, with Burkina Faso, with the Ivory Coast, with Guinea and Senegal. We have approximately 541,980 inhabitants, with 1,241,231 square meters. The capital is Bamako. We have 19 regions. Mali is divided into 19 regions. And our president is Ibrahim Boubacar, who was elected in 2019. Our legislative elections will took place in April 2020. And we have 45 deputies who were elected. So the particularity of this election is the security situation. There was a time
where the pandemic of COVID-19 affected us. Next slide, please. So, as you will see here, these are the different localities and regions in Mali. You can see it here on the map, and we can also see our neighboring countries. Next slide. Next, please. So, as I told you, during elections, we had approximately 7,663,000 voters distributed in 22,000 polling stations. The President of the Republic decided that elections will take place, taking into consideration all necessary measures in order to avoid the propagation of COVID-19. Also, my ministry, meaning the Minister of Territorial Administration and Decentralization, created a steering committee for elections 2020. This committee had 6 commissions: the Commission of Administration, Training, Logistics, Finance, Communication, Security, and Technical one. So the Ministry of Territorial Administration and Decentralization, they conducted several activities to fight against the pandemic through the commission. And we had 2 components here. First of all, the information component, information, communication, and awareness component. And the second is the materials for protection against the pandemic. That's the second component. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Can you pass to the next slide? So the component of information, communication, and awareness, I was saying that the ministry put a commission of communication that was in charge of supervising and informing the voters about all the measures and barriers. In this frame, what we did was we put sketches in 9 languages, and promotion spots were elaborated. And these contained how to wear your mask when you get out of your house, that you have to wash your hands with the soap before entering the polling stations. I will explain here that the voting centers or the polling centers, there is the polling centers, and here they have several voting offices. Also, some of the aspects and measures to respect social distance. So they have to have 1 meter at least between voters, and also to use the alcoholic gel when or upon entering the voting offices or the polling station, and also to wash your hands when you leave the voting offices. I would like to, I presume that these sketches and publicity, they were published on televisions and radio stations from 8th of March until 19th of April. And we also installed an information center with the support of PACE and the United Nations Development Program. This had the objective to give all information on elections and what are the protection measures that we should take in place. We also elaborated some posters and flyers during the pandemic, and they were also distributed. We also organized a press release on the elections and press conferences on the elections with all the journalists, whether it was private or public media. also at information level given to participants, and we gave all the necessary information to participants and voters. Next, can you pass please to the next slide? Next slide. So the ministry took some dispositions in order to protect ourselves during the pandemic. As I said, we had 22,147 offices for voting or polling stations in the country, and in all those offices we distributed washing kits for hands with soaps. All the members of the voting centers were given masks and gloves for their protection. We also distributed at the entry of each office 1 million masks that were given to us on the occasion of these elections by the deputies, and we recruited more than 1,000 young persons in order to help in distributing the masks and raise awareness amongst voters regarding the measures and protective measures that were put in place by the government. Can you pass to the next slide, please? Next slide. So, in conclusion, we took all the measures
يعني أن أعطيكم الخلاصة.
Voilà, donc toutes les dispositions ont été
consideration so that elections would take place. So the period of end of the elections, 14 days after, we did not have an increase in the pandemic, which proves that the elections did not have any effect on the pandemic. So 14 days, we saw that after 14 days of the elections, we did not have an increase in the cases. And this is very important. This means that we used very good methods in order to counter this pandemic. And that is very important to notice. Today in Mali, we have 1,580 positive cases of COVID-19, and we have 86 deaths. 30 and many of them
شكرا جزيلا السيد أميني. ذلك كان رائعا من
measures, especially given that the elections were very early in the onset of the pandemic. And you even established a commission or a committee that looked into the measures needed. I think this is a good best practice for EMBs that are at the moment planning for elections the rest of the year. We already have questions coming in, which we will get to you during the day. We will get you the questions there for you, but for now, sorry, go ahead.
He's just saying that he's listening to you, so you can proceed.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll go to our third speaker before we summarize the discussions thus far, and then get to our Q&A. Our third speaker is, of course, Dr. Imad Sae. He is the chairman of the Election Commission of Libya. He's been working in elections and conflict settings in his country since the transition began. He is also the former chairperson of the Arab EMBs Association, which is an organization of EMBs in the Arab states which he helped to launch in 2015 and gave it the direction, and it's been an active organization since. Dr. Ahmad, we really appreciate you being here. I think the experience of Libya is useful for us in this region, but as well globally. I know that you have a major challenge on your hands, and there's no clarity on an electoral calendar, but you are asked to prepare for elections during a pandemic. So I will turn it over to you to maybe share some experience and some points on the Libya electoral process. And if you can unmute yourself to do so, you have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. In the beginning, I would like to thank Mr. Luis Martinez and his team for their efforts, valuable efforts that enabled us to communicate and to continue discussing whatever related to the management of the electoral processes in an environment that is full of crisis and conflict, and the last one is the COVID-19. This crisis created other
d'autres mesures et d'autres situations que nous
that there are other ways of communications and we can use, and it could be useful in an easy way. And this way is one of them, the way we are communicating right now, although that I have some notes or some observations about this tool. So hopefully in the future it's going to be developed and improved to be more useful. Anyway, theoretically speaking, crises that surround the management of the electoral process. This is what we define as the preparedness. If we define the preparedness is the ability or the capability of the electoral authority to manage or to achieve the electoral process, and its impact is going to be, or the ability to do so is called preparedness. The more crises we have that surround the management of the electoral process, the more or the less preparedness the authority is going to have, and it's going to have more impact on the electoral process. So the relationship between them is reversed. So in Libya, we work on two bases in dealing with the crisis. The first one is, or says, that we need to be as far as possible from the center of the crisis, meaning, in other words, the farthest we are from the core of the crisis, the more the authority would be able to function and to manage the electoral process. The other basis or the other rule would say not to link between the management of risks or crises, because if the electoral authority is going to link its management with the other risks or with the other crises, it's going to be more difficult for the authority to manage the process. So these two rules or ground rules need to be put in consideration while the authority manage the electoral processes. In Libya, we have a compound crisis. We have security crisis, a political crisis, and the last one is the COVID-19 crisis. The current impact on the electoral management in Libya is represented in the political crisis and the security crisis that the country is going through. To add to that, COVID-19 crisis is related to the internal environment, because currently we don't have elections and we don't have a calendar or a timetable for elections. So that's why we dealt with this pandemic, or our response to this pandemic was to have some procedures or precautions on how to deal in the future with our elections. My first part, or the first part of my intervention, is about the security and political management, and the other one is about the external and the impact of the external environment on the preparedness and the readiness of the management of elections. And the other part is about how the management or the authority is dealing with the internal environment, with the related to the issue of COVID-19. There are some requirements pertaining to the political crisis that the electoral authority needs to manage, and this is what we already have and what we already do in Libya. We deal with these priorities. The first element is represented, or the first requirement is represented in avoiding contacting or to be in direct contact with the political parties of the conflict, because they are very sensitive towards the electoral authority. So we prefer to avoid direct contact with them, so our contact wouldn't be interpreted with one of the parties that we are biased to them. We adopt what is known as reducing the activities that have raising awareness perspectives, and that could be interpreted by one of the parties like we are being biased, and we are pushing the audience, we are pushing the citizens towards one of the parties. And we know that there are some people that are very sensitive, and they may feel concerned about being excluded from the authority, from the presidency. And of course, there's another request, which is, or there's another rule that's reducing being very shown or very obvious to the media, and only being restricted to some raising awareness, or to some knowledgeable increasing the knowledge of the audience about the electoral process. And when we talk about the security chaos, this means that the security forces are unable to provide secure centers for the elections, and by this, this is considered the stage of the security chaos. In Libya, we went through a lot of these crises, which had negative impact. I don't want to talk about the details of those incidents, but what we are needed here actually, maybe we were not at the level of such security incidents because we didn't expect that political issues would develop in such a way to be a severe security crisis that had a lot of negative impact on the different aspects of Libya in general, and on the political life in Libya in specific. So what we are needed here to do, and I admit that we are all not doing our best in dealing with the security crisis, because we didn't have the clear vision about the political trend. We are currently developing a plan to face the security crisis, and this needs us to be close to the developing incidents and events of the security issues, and these incidents may have a direct impact on the electoral authority. So we developed a contingency plan, and we established an operation room to follow up on our different centers or offices in scattered in Libya, because lately, in the last 2 weeks, number of our offices were destroyed. First one was in Ajelat city, and the last office was in Rohana city. They were destroyed by some of those people who may benefit from the security chaos. We trained our employees to evacuate in any case of a chaos or a security crisis, and we trained them how to evacuate also their tools, their devices, and also how to deal with the armed forces that could be in direct contact with them. This is in a brief pertaining to the political and security crisis. If I talk about COVID-19 crisis, in a brief and quickly, currently we don't have elections, and we don't expect any close elections in close future, in near future. So the impact, we don't expect a lot of the impact of COVID-19 on elections, but we expect like some of our employees may refuse to continue working unless we have good health conditions. And maybe also security companies or the companies that provide security may or he means insurance may refrain from providing health insurance for the employees, and also contractors that we contracted with to provide us with a lot of to supply a lot of works, a lot of devices. Also, they have a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems, and we need to solve our problems with them. Other companies that provide some sanitation supplies and procurements, we may also have some problems with them, and this may affect the process of elections. This is in general, and pertaining how we deal with COVID-19 crisis. Unfortunately, we reviewed the health conditions within the management of the electoral process, so we know how to deal with this pandemic in the future. Currently, we reduced the employees to the minimum. Also, we follow some conditions in dealing with some of the contractors and negotiating with them so that we wouldn't lose any of our contracts with them in the future. In 2021, we will specify a budget to cover the costs due to functioning within some specific conditions in the era of the pandemic. Of course, we gave up some of the services delivered to our employees, and it would be replaced with some compensations to our employees. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imad. I think the BIA has some fantastic, good examples of what those of you that are working in conflict context can do. And there are already some questions that speak to how you address the conflict on, the EMB stuck between the two sides, and particularly how you can use the election as an entry point to resolve that conflict. But I'll bring those questions to you after I go to our first speaker. The questions of Ahmad Zaid for you refer to the digital divide. A couple of questions on technology. One, of course, there is probably a large digital divide in your country, we would assume. But also, how do you see technology as an entry point during this period? And then how you also see sort of the reform process playing into the anticipated intra-Afghan negotiations. Can you share some thoughts on this as the questions are coming in from our viewers today?
Thank you, Nadia, and thanks to colleagues for the questions. The first one on digital divide, obviously in our country, our infrastructure, IT infrastructure is quite basic, and the digital divide is also very real. That's why I made a comment on automation rather than e-voting or e-registration. How human input in electoral management process could be minimized simply to address the trust issue, but manage the process in a way that addresses people's concerns. So when it comes to digital divide, I mean, the first change last year that the Afghan government decided upon was to roll out these biometric data capturing devices. Initially, the plan was to conduct registration with these devices, but eventually they had to only rely on voter verification to ensure that people do not vote multiple times. There is a start where, without really using the relying on the internet, that you could use technology. But that's the area, I think, where international electoral expertise is needed, not only just to draw the automated process, but also help EMVs understand what steps they need to take before they fully decide on automating an electoral process or a component of it. So the point I was trying to allude to was more a model of consultation and a roadmap and understanding by EMVs on how they can use technology in the best possible manner, rather than just deciding we are going for e-voting or e-registration, which will result in failures, obviously. The second point on how electoral discussions could be approached in the negotiations with the Taliban. Obviously, if the discussion is black and white, whether we should have elections or we should just agree on a reset of the whole political process, I'm biased towards supporting elections. So my sense would be no election should come first. But obviously, reality might unfold differently. And for that reason, I think what needs to be done is not to necessarily decide between A and B, a reset or going for elections, but discussions on the political system overall and what type of elections this country might need, rather than just deciding between elections and an alternative as a process. There's simply no alternative better than even the worst elections.
Thanks, Abdullah. One more question. It's more of a comment from Hisham, but I'd like you to touch on it. It has to do with the role of civil society. Hisham from Palestine makes a point of the value that civil society has in the ideas and solutions that you can get from them. Can you maybe touch upon what the role of civil society is in elections in Afghanistan and your take on this?
I think one of the missing points in any electoral reform efforts in Afghanistan has been the input in consultation process, which involves stakeholders, including civil society organizations and even political parties. So I believe more needs to be done on the civil society's part for them to understand their advocacy role in helping influence change that they want to see in the electoral process, but also for decision makers to involve them more meaningfully in the process. So if you ask about a model, for example, when it comes to approaching electoral reforms, there is no model as to what country should adapt what electoral system or what kind of a process they need to adapt. But the model being a consultative process that has input from all sectors of the society, including civil society, observer organizations, political parties, that is what makes electoral reforms sustainable, I believe.
Thank you so much. I hope this answered questions. If not, feel free to continue the conversation in the chat box. I will now go to our speaker from Mali. There are several questions. I will just take them in order. We have a question coming in from Mirel, who's in Lebanon joining us. She asks, how were disputes arising out of the elections in Mali settled? Is the judiciary working normally there? Did the different stakeholders have access to the competent judicial authorities? You can unmute yourself, Mr. Amini. Osama, can you unmute him? You're now.
Yes, now we can hear you. The elections in Mali, the disputes that come from the elections for the presidential elections and the legislative elections, and then by the administrative tribunals for the local regions and regional ones. So we have two disputes that came from the presidential or legislative. These will go to the constitutional tribunal, which will resolve any disputes. And others are done and dealt by the courts on the local level or the regional levels. Now, do we have any disputes between political deputies, for example? Yes, these are held by the constitutional court or the administrative court who will settle them. The constitutional courts, when they validate, then you cannot appeal after that. Once the decision is made, you cannot appeal. And once the elections are done, the Ministry of Decentralization will proclaim the temporary results. And once it is done, what today represents
que quieren hoy, si quieren hacer reclamaciones,
لديهم 48 ساعة للقيام بذلك أمام
So after the proclamation, temporary one, once we can have the temporary result of the administration ministry, this is how things go. But I can confirm that today we have a judicial system that allows for all those who want to raise a claim, they can do that. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. Maybe two more questions for you, Mr. Amini. One is on the low voter turnout in your elections, 35%. The audience would like to know what impact the COVID pandemic had on the turnout, and how the results of the election play into the political conflict or the resolution of it. Over to you.
If I understood well your question, the question, what is the impact of COVID-19 of the input of the elections, right?
What was the impact of the pandemic on the low turnout? I don't hear
Uh, do you hear me? Can you please repeat the question because it was interrupted due to technical issues?
Yeah, I know there's a breakage in the connection with translation. So the question is on the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic in your country on the low voter turnout, and also what role this election plays into the conflict or the resolution of the conflict in Mali.
The first question, the impact of COVID-19 on the elections, the impact of COVID-19 played a big role on the percentage of participation, because we know that lots of people are afraid to come and vote. So the level of participation was weaker than usual. That is one of the things. The second thing is that the security problem also had an impact on the level of participation, because we have the north and center of Mali that have some security issues and difficulties, and this has influenced the level and percentage of participation in terms of elections. This is what my answer is, if I well understood the question.
Thank you very much. One more question on Mali, and this comes from our colleagues in Bolivia, and where they also have an ethnically diverse country. The question is on how you try to reach the rural sectors in your country in terms of voter and civic education, especially during a pandemic. How were you able to get information on the safety measures and the general voter education information to rural areas during a pandemic? If you could touch on that, thank you.
So how could we reach the rural areas during the elections, correct?
Yes, how did we be able to reach rural areas during a pandemic?
So during the pandemic, we tried to touch these zones through communication. So we have some people who are placed in proximities, and in our country we have what we call the public, who actually do communication amongst the population and between us and the population. In terms of communication, today we have I spoke about the sketches, and this is like theater pieces that are animated on villages level and that promote the effect of the pandemic actually. And as I said in my presentation, the television is not reached everywhere, but what we did is that we also publicized on the radio, because radio is heard out by everybody, and this helped in explaining what we wanted to do. We also have NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, and also local organizations who work in
تعمل معنا بهذا الاتجاه، ولدينا شركاء دعمونا في هذا المجال وساعدونا
on the ground and disseminate information, and we managed to face all difficulties despite the security problems that we have.
Thank you so much. I hope that answered your question, colleagues in Bolivia. I'd like to go to Dr. Imad. This also comes from Bolivia, where they're also suffering from political polarization. The question reads, from my perspective, there's a serious risk that the results of our election in September, the expected elections in September, will not be recognized by sectors that come up undefeated. So the losing sides, they expect, will not accept the election results. How do you think the electoral authorities there can mitigate this risk and also limit potential violence?
For the decision of elections, it's not the decision for the electoral authority, it's the decision of the legislative authority of the country. Hence, the task of the electoral authority is only about the enacting or the implementation of the decision made by the legislative authority to manage the electoral process. So hence, we don't have the results of the electoral process on our shoulders. These elections may exacerbate the political crisis. So the electoral authority doesn't take the responsibility of the results of the elections. I think the task of the electoral authority need only to be sending messages for the voters and for the political parties that it deals with everybody sanely. It's not biased to any political party, and also to gain the trust of the voters pertaining the procedures taken by this authority to facilitate the process. Like the most important thing, procedures taken in case there is any forgery for the elections, because anyone who suspects a forgery need to have the right to appeal, and this process may have some issues about not being transparent, or having some forgeries, or some other problems. So we need to manage this. There was another element that we had in the domain of elections, which is the health conditions and in the electoral centers and electoral centers and electoral chambers. Some of the candidates may not trust the electoral process because of the conditions of the center that the citizens vote at. They don't follow the conditions of the Ministry of Health or the WHO, especially that the electoral laws didn't mention or never dealt with such a condition before. And the Ministry of Health considered the pandemic as a new partner or a new element. So they need to take into consideration this element, and any deficit, any default in the electoral process would lead to the failure of the process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmad. We're coming close to the end of our session, but questions are coming in. Dr. Ahmad, I'll throw in a couple more questions to you that came in, if you can very quickly touch on them. One is how technology has been used or is being used by the Commission there in Libya to address sort of the friction that exists in society, and also how are you reaching out and engaging youth, and do you see that youth participation as a way to facilitate a resolution to ongoing conflicts in your country?
As for using the technology in our electoral process, it's about the registration of the voters. We use SMSs and SMSs system, and the voter choose one center, specific center, and he or she sends the number for the system of the authority. And if he has the conditions of the age and the nationality, he becomes in the voters registry. And as for the communication or the social distancing, we use this in the voters registration only, and we are developing the electoral process by having more technology in the electoral process. And we are currently studying using the technology to verify the identity and not only voting. So hence this stage of voting by using this technology, we still didn't reach this stage, and we didn't have any procedure pertaining to this stage. And there's a question on my screen, or there's a question, sorry, about the participation of youth. Of course, youth need to have a lot of communication because they consist 60% of the Libyan society currently, and communicating with this category is very difficult, and it's very difficult to convince them to participate in the electoral process, and they have different ambitions from previous generations. Like when I talk about the youth of 2021, it's not the same youth of the 18th century or the 19th century or the 20th century. So hence the current young people are very difficult, and it's a generation that use technology in a way they think that by technology, they can achieve their ambitions and their aspirations for the future. But we think that we need to use the same tool they use. We need to use technology to reach them and to encourage them to be involved in the political process and to participate in the electoral process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imad. We have more questions coming in. We will run out of time. I will just throw a question out to our colleague from Mali. It's on what do you recommend, Mr. Amini, countries can do, countries that will have elections in the next 12 months during a pandemic period. What would you suggest that they do to ensure turnout numbers do not drop significantly? If you can unmute yourself. Sama, can you unmute Mr. Amini, please? We can hear you. Okay, so the question is, what would you recommend to EMBs who will have elections in the next 12 months, what they can do to make sure that turnout numbers do not decrease significantly?
I understood the question. I think that the experience of Mali and for countries and MPs have elections during the pandemic, and especially for countries who have security issues like us. So first of all, you should have a documentation, electoral documentation, well consolidated, because this document is the basic of all consensuses. That is the first thing. Second thing, you should be able to assist all the political actors, these political parties, the civil society, and to have them participate in the electoral process from the beginning to the end. Also, we have to call upon the electoral colleges from the beginning until we have the results. So everybody should participate and everybody should be there and have a certain confidence. Also, I think that since we are not done with the pandemic, today we have to, and as I already said, we have to put all the means possible to protect the citizen and raise their confidence in us so that they go and vote without having fear of attracting the virus. So we have to ensure them that they are safe, and this is very important. How today we can instill confidence in our population. This is very important, and I think that if these elements, if to have a good electoral document today, the participation of everybody in the electoral process is important. Also, give all the guarantees that I mentioned already regarding the pandemic to ensure and reassure the citizens, to raise their awareness, also to reassure them in terms of security issues, because for all the countries who want to do elections, especially those who have security issues, today we have to put all the means to protect the citizens so that they will say, if I go to vote, I am not risking my life, I am not risking trapping or getting the pandemic or the virus. And I think these are the measures that I recommend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot in there in that response and in your PowerPoint, which we will link. We will provide a link to and make available when we share the recording of this webinar. We're running out of time. I will just pass the last question to Mr. Ahmadzai from Afghanistan. I'll wrap two questions into one. One was directly on the role of the judiciary. How do you see that playing in this context? And then also a question more general on how or are the measures that EMBs are putting in place now for COVID-19, are they temporary or should they be part of a longer term institutional reform measures? So if you can touch on those quickly.
Thank you, Nadia. I think there was also a question about the youth that was addressed to all of the panelists. So I will try to respond to that. And I believe Afghanistan is also a country of a majority of youth. Our population of youth is over 65%, probably more than even in Libya. So one is the question of what state can do to basically make sure that the youth's voices are heard and their participations in political processes are ensured. But the other question, which is more important, is how youth themselves could become a multiplier force in making sure that they advocate for change. So I think there is much more support needed for youth organizations. Could actually be enabled enough for them to be to demand the change that they want to see in the electoral process or the political negotiations with the Taliban, for example. In the composition of our negotiation team on the government side, we have more than half of the members being under 35 years of age, which is quite significant, but it's still inadequate when it comes to women's representation and the interests that they represent. So a process that really gives a platform to the youth to be able to raise their voice and make their demands need to be empowered and established. The point about legislation, procedurally, the implementing agency, as per the Afghan laws, would need to come up with an amendment into the legislation as a bill that then goes to Ministry of Justice, and then following their review, the parliaments enact it, and then the president endorses it into a law. So that's the technical process, but the point I was trying to make was because we are not expecting elections in another 2 years because of the impact of COVID in Afghanistan. Therefore, the discussions need to be much broader than creating COVID resilience in our electoral processes and our legislations. So how can we discuss broader electoral reform and the discussions around that that could then be reflected in the electoral law at a later stage, which is a very standard process where the Election Commission in this case would need to amend the law, and then it goes through the legislative process before it gets endorsed by the president.
Thank you. I think that's a good point to end on, that essentially COVID-19 and the response that EMBs and electoral assistance providers are having can be part of a broader long-term sustainable development process. And this is why we're happy to bring this conversation to you. Hopefully it feeds into your discussions on the ground on response to the pandemic in your countries. This brings us to the end of our session. Again, I would like to thank all the panel members and all you participants. Thank you again. You've been very active in the chat box. The questions were enlightening. I hope the responses were also great and helpful to you. Again, I want to thank the translators. This is the first time that we offered this in 4 languages. I know there were some connection issues, but I hope that you were able to get most of the content of our discussion. We have these webinars planned every 2 weeks, but I want to take the opportunity to invite you to another webinar that we are hosting as UNDP tomorrow, which is focused particularly on the African continent. If there are the JTF colleagues, they can put the link in the chat box. It would be great to see you there as well. Please follow us on Twitter. You can view the recordings of this webinar on our YouTube channel. Please do engage and send us any suggestions that you have. You know how to reach us by email. Unless there are anything pending, I think we just want to thank you once again for being here and hopefully see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you again, Dr. Ahmad, Mr. Ahmad Zai, and Mr. Amini from Mali. It was a fantastic panel.